The average American household is now worth $1.06 million. That's not a motivational quote. That's not a headline from social media. That's actual data. But here's the strange part. If the average household in America is a millionaire, why do so many people feel like they're barely getting by? Why does the typical family not look live or feel anything like what we imagine a millionaire to be? Imagine a man leaving his house early in the morning for work. He drives an ordinary car. He lives in a normal neighborhood. Nothing about his life looks extraordinary. Yet on paper, he is a millionaire. And when you look closely at the numbers behind American wealth, you start to realize something unsettling. The word millionaire might not mean what most people think it means. And once you see the data behind it, you might start questioning everything you thought you knew about money in America. To understand what's really going on, we need to start with a simple distinction that almost nobody talks about: the difference between average and median. According to the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, the average net worth of an American household reached about $1.06 million. That number sounds incredible. It sounds like the country is filled with millionaires. But averages can be deceptive. If one person in a room earns $10 million a year, while everyone else earns $50,000, the average income in that room suddenly looks very high, even though most people there are nowhere close to that level of wealth. That's exactly what's happening with American household wealth. When you look at the median net worth, which represents the middle point, where half of households have more and half have less, the number drops dramatically. The median net worth of American households is about $192,700. That's not even close to $1 million. So how does the average become so high? The answer lies in the distribution of wealth. According to data from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, the top 10% of American households hold about 67% of all wealth in the country. That means the remaining 90% of households share the other 1/3. When a small group at the top controls such a large portion of total wealth, the average gets pulled upward. The number starts to look impressive, even though it doesn't represent the experience of most families. And yet the millionaire population in the United States is still very real. As of 2022, roughly 18% of American households qualified as millionaires by net worth, which means they had at least $1 million in assets after subtracting all debts. That's about 23.7 million households. By 2024, that number had grown to approximately 23.8 million. In fact, according to UBS data, the United States added about 379,000 new millionaires in 2024 alone. So the country does contain millions of millionaire households. But here's the important question. If most of them are not celebrities, not hedge fund managers, and not tech founders, then who are they? What kind of people quietly build seven-figure net worth without appearing rich at all? And more importantly, what are they doing differently from everyone else? Because when you stop looking at social media and start looking at the actual data, a surprisingly consistent pattern begins to appear. Once you move past the headlines and start looking at the data itself, something interesting begins to appear. Millionaires in America don't seem to follow some secret strategy. They aren't financial geniuses who discovered hidden investment tricks. In fact, most of them follow patterns that look surprisingly ordinary. The first pattern is simple: they save consistently. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the personal saving rate in the United States is currently around 4.4%. In other words, the typical American household saves about 4 cents out of every dollar of disposable income. That number hasn't always looked like that. During the pandemic, when spending opportunities suddenly disappeared and stimulus checks arrived, the saving rate briefly spiked to about 33.8%. But once life returned to normal, those savings were quickly spent. Today, most households are back to saving very little. Federal Reserve data from recent surveys shows that only about 55% of adults have enough savings to cover 3 months of expenses. Even more concerning, roughly 30% of adults have no emergency savings at all. Millionaire households behave differently. In a large study of American millionaires, about 75% of respondents said consistent investing over long periods of time was the most important factor in building their wealth. Not brilliant market timing, not risky speculation. Consistency. What makes this especially interesting is that high income alone does not explain the difference. In that same study, only about 31% of millionaires said they had averaged more than $100,000 per year in income during their careers. That means a large portion of millionaire households built their wealth without ever having extremely high salaries. The difference is often not how much money people earn, but what they consistently do with it. The second pattern is participation in investing. According to the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, direct stock ownership increased from 15% of American families in 2019 to about 21% in 2022. That was the largest increase in decades. But even with that increase, the majority of households still do not invest in stocks directly. In fact, roughly 79% of American families own no individual stocks at all. When retirement accounts such as 401ks and IRAs are included, participation rises somewhat. About 54% of U.S. households have money in retirement accounts, but that still means nearly half of households have no retirement savings. Millionaire households look very different. Research shows that roughly 80% of millionaires invested in their company's 401k plan, and about 3 out of 4 invested additional money outside of those plans through brokerage accounts, retirement accounts, or other investment vehicles. Again, the key pattern is not complicated strategies. It is simply participation. The third pattern involves the use of tax-advantaged accounts. Retirement accounts quietly play a massive role in long-term wealth building. According to national data, the median retirement account balance among households that have one is about $87,000. Average 401k balances reported by financial dashboards show roughly $32,558, while average total retirement savings among active savers is around $481,435. But these averages hide another important fact. Only about 14% of eligible workers actually maximize their 401k contributions each year. Most people leave part of that tax-advantaged space unused. Over a working career that can last 30 or 40 years, those unused contributions can translate into hundreds of thousands of dollars in missed compound growth. The fourth pattern appears in one of the largest expenses in any household budget: housing. Housing represents about 33% of the average household spending according to data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. For many families, it is the largest monthly cost. But among millionaire households, housing tends to represent a smaller portion of total wealth. Studies suggest that the primary residence accounts for roughly 32% of a typical millionaire household's net worth. That means a majority of their wealth is invested in assets that can grow over time, rather than being concentrated entirely in their home. Finally, there is the factor that may be the most important of all time. When researchers analyze wealth data across age groups, they find that the average age of a millionaire household head is about 61 years old. Roughly 2/3 of American millionaires fall between the ages of 60 and 79. By contrast, only about 9.8% of millionaires are between the ages of 35 and 44. Wealth building takes time. According to studies of millionaire households, the typical person spent about 28 years working, saving, and investing before reaching a net worth of $1 million, almost 3 decades. That time horizon changes the entire way wealth should be understood. Because when you combine consistent saving, steady investing tax advantages, controlled housing costs, and enough time for compounding to work, the result can quietly grow into something very large. If the math behind wealth building is relatively simple, why do so many people struggle to follow it? The answer has less to do with intelligence and far more to do with psychology. For most people, the biggest challenge is that the early years of wealth building feel almost invisible. Imagine investing $100,000 and earning a return of 10%. That produces about $10,000 in growth. It is progress, but it does not dramatically change your life. Now imagine the same 10% return applied to $1 million. Suddenly, that same percentage produces $100,000 in growth. The math is identical, but the experience feels completely different. In the beginning, compounding is slow. It almost feels like nothing is happening. Many people lose patience during this phase and abandon the strategy before the real acceleration ever arrives. Another psychological barrier is the illusion created by modern media. Every day, people see stories about overnight success. A young entrepreneur sells a company. A trader makes a fortune in a single year. A celebrity posts photos of luxury lifestyles that seem effortless. These stories create a distorted picture of how wealth normally develops. When researchers look at actual wealth data, the pattern is much less dramatic. The average age of a millionaire household head is about 61 years old, and 2/3 of millionaires fall between the ages of 60 and 79. That means the majority of millionaire wealth appears after decades of steady progress, not in a burst of sudden success. The typical timeline also reinforces this pattern. Studies of millionaire households show that it often takes about 28 years of working, saving, and investing to reach a net worth of $1 million. Nearly 3 decades. Another belief that often discourages people is the assumption that most wealthy families inherited their money. But the research suggests a different story. In large surveys of American millionaires, about 79% reported receiving no inheritance at all. Around 21% received some form of inheritance, but only 16% received more than $100,000, and just 3% inherited $1 million or more. In other words, most millionaire households built their wealth gradually rather than receiving it from family. Economic forces also shape how people make financial decisions. Inflation quietly changes the value of money over time. According to data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, $100 in the year 2000 would require roughly $195 by the end of 2025 to maintain the same purchasing power. Money sitting in cash slowly loses value as prices rise. Assets that grow over time behave differently. When investments are allowed to compound for many years, the growth can begin to outpace inflation and produce meaningful increases in wealth. Understanding this difference between short-term comfort and long-term growth often determines whether people continue investing or abandon the process. The psychological challenge, then, is not simply learning the math. It is accepting that the path to wealth often looks slow, ordinary, and even boring for a very long time. And that realization leads to a final question. If the patterns in the data are so consistent, what can someone actually do with that information? So if the patterns behind wealth building are this consistent, what can someone actually do with that information? The first step is not a complicated financial strategy. It is a shift in how you think about money over time. One of the most common patterns among wealthy households is something surprisingly simple: they save before they spend. Many people approach saving as whatever is left at the end of the month. Bills are paid, daily expenses happen, and if there is anything remaining, a small portion might go into savings. But households that build long-term wealth often reverse that process. Saving becomes the first step rather than the last. Even when the amount changes from month to month, the habit itself stays consistent. Over long periods of time, that difference in behavior compounds dramatically. The second step involves participation in investment markets. A large portion of American households still keep most of their money in cash or low-yield accounts. While this can feel safe in the short term, it creates a long-term problem when inflation slowly reduces the purchasing power of that money. As we mentioned earlier, $100 in the year 2000 requires roughly $195 by the end of 2025 to maintain the same purchasing power. That gradual loss often goes unnoticed year to year. Investments behave differently because they allow money to grow over time. Historical market returns, while unpredictable in the short run, have often averaged around long-term growth levels that outpace inflation. This does not mean every investment will succeed, and it certainly does not eliminate risk. I am not offering financial advice here. These examples simply illustrate patterns that appear repeatedly in long-term wealth data. The third step involves taking advantage of tax-advantaged accounts whenever possible. Retirement accounts, such as employer-sponsored plans, often make saving and investing easier because contributions can happen automatically. When money moves into those accounts before it reaches everyday spending, it removes some of the temptation to use it elsewhere. Over time, that automation becomes extremely powerful. As we discussed earlier, only about 14% of eligible workers fully maximize their 401k contributions each year. That means the majority of workers are leaving a portion of those tax advantages unused. Over decades, even modest contributions inside tax-advantaged accounts can grow into significant balances. The fourth step focuses on controlling the largest expenses in a household budget. Housing alone represents about 33% of average household spending in the United States. When housing costs rise too high relative to income, it becomes extremely difficult to save or invest consistently. By contrast, households that keep housing closer to manageable levels often create more financial flexibility. That flexibility allows them to maintain savings during unexpected events, such as job changes, economic downturns, or family expenses. The final step may be the most difficult psychologically thinking in decades rather than months. Many financial goals today are framed around quick results. But the data we've discussed shows that wealth accumulation is often a very long-term process. If the typical timeline to reach a net worth of $1 million is roughly 28 years, then the early stages will almost always feel slow. That slow beginning is not failure. It is simply the natural shape of compounding. Small, consistent decisions repeated over many years often produce results that look dramatic only in hindsight. So when people imagine a millionaire, they often picture something dramatic: a luxury lifestyle, a brilliant investor, someone who made a fortune overnight. But when you look at the actual data, the picture looks very different. In many cases, a millionaire is simply someone who spent decades doing a few ordinary things consistently. Saving before spending. Investing rather than leaving money in cash. Using retirement accounts that offer tax advantages. Keeping major expenses like housing under control. And most importantly, giving those decisions enough time to compound. Remember the two numbers that started this conversation. The average American household net worth is about $1.06 million, but the median net worth is only about $192,700. Those two numbers tell the story of how uneven wealth distribution can be, but they also reveal something else. Millions of households have still managed to reach seven-figure net worths without extraordinary starting conditions. Roughly 18% of American households are millionaires, representing about 23.7 million households, and that number has continued to grow, reaching around 23.8 million by 2024, with approximately 379,000 new millionaires added in that year alone. Most of them did not inherit their wealth. Most of them did not become rich quickly. And most of them do not look particularly wealthy from the outside. The path that appears in the data is not glamorous. It is slow, steady, and often invisible for many years. But over time, those ordinary decisions begin to add up. So the real question is not whether building wealth is possible. The data suggests that millions of households have already done it. The real question is whether someone is willing to stay consistent long enough to let those small decisions compound. And that's something worth thinking about. If you found this discussion interesting, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd also be curious to hear when you first started thinking seriously about saving or investing. And if you enjoy exploring real financial data and the stories behind it, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next conversation.